Well, I'm not just a former UN weapons inspector. The reason why I was selected as a UN weapons inspector is that before that, I was an INF inspector. I worked for the On-Site Inspection Agency and was one of the initial cadre of inspectors to implement the INF treaty. In fact, I was the first U.S. inspector on the ground in the Soviet Union when the treaty went into force back on July 1st of 1988. So I know this treaty inside and out. Um, and I also understand the importance of this treaty. Just a little bit of history. Intermediate range, forces have been part of the military reality of Europe for some time now. But they they weren't seen as, game changing. They were just part of an overall range of military options available to both sides of the military equation, NATO and the Warsaw Pact. But the Russians had relatively older systems, the SS-4, the SS-5, liquid-fueled systems that were not responsive to, emerging situations. They had other systems that they deployed later, like the SS-12, which was a solid rocket system, but it was a single warhead. It was seen more of being a glamorous Scud missile. The 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 whole situation changed, however, in the late 1970s when Russia deployed this new missile, the SS-20, RS-10, the Pioneer. Three warheads, road mobile, um, and just an absolute game changer. Basically, it guaranteed the physical destruction of Europe in case of any war between the Soviet Union and Europe, and there was nothing Europe could do to defend themselves from it.
I mean, this really shows how destabilizing the SS 20 was. It wasn't just another missile, it changed the whole deterrence equation. The US and NATO suddenly had to confront the very real prospect of Europe being obliterated in minutes, forcing strategic choices that were less about balance and more about survival.
Um, And so this created sort of the ultimate form of deterrence. And from the European and American standpoint, the deployment by the Soviets of the SS-20 also created an imbalance when it comes to the pressure that can be placed on nations. The whole concept of nuclear deterrence is that no nation would be able to use its nuclear force to intimidate other nations to achieve certain geopolitical outcomes, because the other nations would have their own nuclear capabilities that could, be used in retaliation. There was parity, mutually assured destruction, things of this nature. The SS-20 being a solid rocket system with the ranges that it had with multiple warheads, literally could blanket all of Europe with nuclear weapons, eliminating the totality of NATO's, capability. And then the question comes from a NATO perspective, would the United States commit suicide on behalf of Europe? Meaning that if the Soviets took out NATO, would the United States implement Article 5, implement its nuclear doctrine, knowing that the Russians, the Soviets had their own strategic nuclear forces that would destroy the United States? Or would the United States, being confronted with this, say, well, so sad, too bad, wouldn't want to be a European today? And so that there needed to be a counter. And so the counter was the deployment by the United States in the early 1980s of its own intermediate range systems, the ground launched cruise missile and the Pershing II solid rocket missile. The Pershing II in particular was deemed to be very threatening to the Soviets because when launched from a position in West Germany, the Pershing II missile, nuclear capable, um, would be able to strike Moscow within 12 minutes, creating a potential decapitation scenario.
To my knowledge, this was one of the most dangerous moments in Cold War nuclear posturing, decapitation capability in minutes. Are you kidding me? That's hair trigger instability. The Soviets had to assume we could erase their command before they even reacted.
This one wasn't really the game changer. The game changer came with a system known as the 9M 927, maybe. I could be off on this number, but it was basically a development of the Iskander M cruise missile that the United States claims the Russians tested as a ground launch cruise missile in violation of the INF Treaty. The Russians say that this didn't happen. I've reviewed as much of the data as humanly possible and without having access to classified information. I'm convinced that the United States got it wrong on this one, that the Russians, the same design bureau that was doing the 9M 927 was doing the Caliber missile, which is a sea-launched missile. You're allowed to test sea-launched missiles from a ground station. Um, the development of the Caliber was taking place in parallel with the development of 9M 927. And I just believe the United States got it wrong, that we misread the intelligence. And, there might have been some compatibility of components of the missiles so that when things are being tested on a Caliber or if they were tested on the 9M 927, they would, the U.S. intelligence, analysts could say, oh, that's really a cruise missile, a long-range cruise missile.
If that's accurate, it's a huge intelligence failure on our part. Misreading technical tests could and did serve as a political pretext to exit a treaty we already wanted gone. That's deeply cynical policymaking.
The Russians tried to assuage our concerns by holding a demonstration. They actually laid out the original 9M, the original Iskander M, and then they put this advance. And what you see, it's the same booster, the exact same propulsion system. The only thing that changes is the warhead and the guidance package. And actually, with this new system, the warhead and the guidance packages are larger. So if you have a larger guidance package and a larger warhead, and you're using the same propulsion system, that means it's probably going to fly less than the range of the other system. And there are ways, that this could have been tested, but the United States wasn't interested in this because while Russia was doing everything possible to be compliant with the INF Treaty, the United States wasn't. We wanted out of this treaty because not because of Russia per se, but because of China. China had developed a whole range of intermediate range systems that we believe gave China an advantage in any potential conflict in the Pacific, and we wanted something that would be able to counter the Chinese INF, but we couldn't do it because of the INF treaty we had with Russia. We claimed that there were no violations, but there were. The Mark 41 Aegis Ashore system uses a containerized launch platform that on board an Aegis ship can not only fire the SM-3 or SM-6 surface-to-air missile, but also the ship-launched cruise missile. Now you take the same system and put it on the ground, and the Russians are like, well, you can launch ground-launched cruise missiles from here.
Here's the tell. We'd been planning the test all along. The public story about Russian violations was basically diplomatic cover. If true, it shows the U.S. walked away for strategic flexibility in Asia, accepting European insecurity as collateral damage.
And we said, no, we're not going to do that. We're not interested in doing that. Don't worry about that. Well, 1 week after we pulled out of the INF Treaty, we tested the Aegis Ashore system using a ground-launched cruise missile. We're liars. We were planning on this all the time. Anybody who's been involved in ballistic missile testing knows that you don't gin up a test within a week, that we had been planning this test for some time now, and we're simply waiting to get out of the treaty to do this. So that's where we are today. There is no treaty and there is no trust between Russia and the United States. The Russians, again, they have better memories than we do. They understand the destabilizing aspect of these weapons. So the Russians told the United States that even though the treaty was no longer in force, it would not develop or deploy INF systems so long as the United States didn't deploy systems into the European theater. Well, a couple of years ago, the United States deployed one of these containerized systems into Denmark to participate in an exercise. The United States said, well, we only had the SM-6 missile in there, which is a short-range missile. But the Russians don't know that. It's a system capable of launching cruise missiles, having tested to fire a cruise missile. So the Russians have to assume the system, when deployed, has cruise missiles. And they said, well, you violated this. So they began developing missiles. At the same time, the United States was also pursuing the development and deployment of a new hypersonic intermediate range system called the Dark Eagle. And so now Russia's looking at a situation where the United States, by developing these systems and deploying these systems, was altering the balance of power in Europe, giving the United States hypersonic preemptive strike capabilities at a time when tensions between NATO and the United States were on the rise with Russia because of Ukraine. And the Ukraine conflict showed the importance of, long-range strike systems. Just imagine putting Dark Eagle or putting the SM-6 Typhoon on Ukrainian soil and the kind of destabilization of impact that would have on Russia, which is one of the reasons why the Russians are fighting this war and ensuring that Ukraine never becomes part of NATO.
I mean, the linkage here between missile deployments and the Ukraine conflict is stark. If Russian leadership sees these systems as existential threats, that colors their entire approach to NATO expansion and regional wars.
And the system is a follow-on to the RS-26 Rubiage that we talked about. This is what we call the Oreshnik system. The Oreshnik is an amalgam of technologies using advanced solid rocket boosters borrowed from the Cedar ICBM. Second stage is borrowed from the YARS ICBM. A modified YARS M reentry vehicle, new warheads using new technologies. And it was flight tested, and the Russians launched what they call an operational test of the Oreshnik in November of 2024, targeting the Dnipro factory in Dnipropetrovsk. But even when they did that, they just were saying we have this capability, but they hadn't operationalized it as a weapon system. It was estimated they had between 4 and 6 additional Oreshniks in the pipeline to be used for testing, but that's not serial production. But then again, the Russians said they're going to begin serial production of the Oreshnik.
This is classic arms race feedback loop, our move, their counter, more advanced capabilities. The Archnik looks designed not just as deterrent, but as a tool to fundamentally shift the European balance of power.
Dmitry Medvedev, the former president of Russia, in which Lindsey Graham threatened a decapitation strike against Russia, outright threatened the Russians, saying if you don't believe that Donald Trump's serious about his intent to punish Russia for failing to bend the knee to Trump's demands about a ceasefire, just ask the Ayatollah what happens, meaning that, ask the Iranian leader who was subjected to a decapitation strike during Israel's 12-day war, a decapitation strike that the United States knew about and facilitated with intelligence information. So that's a direct threat against the Russian government. Medvedev responded saying, we have the dead hand, so you'll die. The dead hand is an allusion to a Cold War era system, the perimeter. Remember when I talked about the Ohio-class submarine being moved up close with flat trajectories? This was a real problem. So the Russians developed the dead hand to ensure that if there was ever a decapitation strike and you took out the Russian leadership, a system was in place using a variety of sensors, radiation detection, seismic sensors, etc., and missiles equipped with a communication system that they would launch these missiles that would fly over Russian territory, broadcasting launch codes, and the totality of Russia's nuclear arsenal would be fired against the United States. So what Medvedev was saying is we have the dead hand. So why are you talking decapitation? Well, Trump didn't understand, and so he immediately ordered, this is the genius of Donald Trump, 2 Ohio-class submarines armed with Trident missiles closer to Russian shores. So if you're trying to convince the Russians that you're not looking to decapitate their leadership, the last thing you would do is deploy 2 Ohio-class submarines closer to Russian shores. And so the Russians now, because of all of this, have said, we have put Oreshnik in serial production, and we are beginning the active deployment of these systems, not just in Russia, but also in Belarus. Belarus is going to get a regiment, that's 9 launchers, of Oreshniks. The Oreshnik is a dual-capable system. It can fire a conventional warhead, or actually cluster warheads, or it can fire nuclear warheads. The Oreshnik is that SS-20-like game-changing weapon. There is no analog in NATO. There's nothing that can counter it, nothing that can defeat it. And once the Oreshnik reaches full operational deployment, as Dmitry Medvedev said in a follow-on tweet, all of the cathedrals of all of the cities of Europe are now at risk because, like the SS-20, the Oreshnik will be able to blanket Europe with destructive power, conventional and nuclear, which gives it an added dimension of military flexibility. Now Russia can destroy all of Europe just using conventional weapons.
That's a chilling escalation. A conventional only Europe wide strike capability removes the nuclear taboo as a constraint. Suddenly, the threshold for massive destruction is far lower.
And when we can thank Donald Trump for this, Dmitry Medvedev, in announcing this, he also alluded to other systems. And this is where we go back to the Cold War. In addition to the SS-20, the Russians were concerned about the Pershing II missile and its ability to strike Moscow. And so they wanted a counter to that. And they were developing a short-range system called the Skorost, or the quick missile. And the purpose of the Skorost was when Pershings were detected leaving their garrisons going to deployment areas, the Skorost could be rapidly sent to the field, fire, and take out the Pershing II. Right now, the Oreshnik, like the SS-20, is not that flexible in terms of its targeting. So if the United States deploys Dark Eagle to Germany, the Russians don't have the ability to interdict Dark Eagle with assurance of success. So I believe that, as was the case of pulling out the RS-26 to create the Oreshnik, I believe that the Russians have pulled out Skorost and they're developing a follow-on system. And Medvedev said there are other systems in play. And when you look at the operational requirements facing the Russians and you mirror that with the operational requirements facing the Soviets back in the 80s, Skorost is an absolute necessity. So I think we're seeing that, and the Russians may come up with others. They had another system that was under development, the Courier small ICBM, actually ready to go into serial production, but was stopped back in 1991 by Gorbachev. And an interesting fact of history: the coup that was launched against Gorbachev in August of 1991 was triggered by Gorbachev signing an order ending the Courier small ICBM system. This created an economic crisis for the Ministry of Defense Industry and the other industries involved in this. That's when the head of the KGB got together with all these different ministers and said Gorbachev's got to go. But that was the straw that broke the camel's back. That shows you how important.
When weapons development decisions can topple political leaders, as with Gorbachev, that tells you these systems aren't just military tools, they're pillars of national power and political survival.
The Oreshnik is a game changer because it puts all of Europe at risk. The United States just deployed B-61 12 bombs to England. The Oreshnik will take out that site within 15 minutes of being launched. It won't exist. There's some speculation that the Oreshnik that was used against Dnipro was a version that had a it was a test warhead. And what I mean by that is, while the submunitions were coated or manufactured out of this new exotic ceramic alloy, there was no explosive material inside. So basically, these were duds that hit the ground. And one of the reasons the Russians did that is to disguise the true destructive capacity of Oreshnik. Because the Russian sources that I've spoken to have said that the true destructive capacity of Oreshnik is far different than what was demonstrated. And that the Oreshnik, when fired, let's say you take a battalion of Oreshniks, that's 3 Oreshnik missiles, that's sort of 108 submunitions, and that you bring those down in a concentrated area. They say that the damage done is the equivalent of a nuclear weapon. And now, if the Russians are deploying, I don't know, 10 regiments of Oreshnik, each regiment has 3 battalions. You see where I'm going on this? Europe doesn't stand a chance, literally. It was the dumbest move in the world was to get out of the INF Treaty, and the second dumbest move in the world was to provoke the Russians. Now the Russians have taken this step. How do we get out of this mess? It's a huge arms control problem, a huge arms control problem. And unfortunately, I don't think we're getting out of it unless we replicate the sense of urgency that came from the 1980s, where there was a crisis, crisis mentality that if we don't sign this treaty, we are all going to die. We need the West to feel the urgency, and That means the West has to deploy systems that make Russia feel at risk. And then now there's a joint reason for both nations to get rid of. The Pershing II is what made the Russians get rid of the SS-20. Is Dark Eagle going to be the system that makes Russia get rid of Oreshnik? I don't know.
This is where the gloves come off, and frankly, it's hard to refute. If the U.S. is enabling war crimes under the banner of strategic partnership, we've crossed a line from moral blind spot into full-blown ethical collapse. Self-destruction isn't alarmist, it's forensic.